Good morning. My name is Kenny Ingram. I look after the construction engineering sector for a company called IFS. And just to explain who IFS are, if you don't know who we are, we're a global software company specialising in project and asset lifecycle software. So today I'm going to talk about this lovely topic called off-site and modular construction, and I think this is one of the most exciting trends in the industry. And I think the conversation today is going to be about how our companies adapting to this trend and what do we need to do to be the winners in the future. So let's crack on with the presentation then. So the agenda for today, I'm going to talk briefly about defining what I mean by off-site and modular construction. Then we're going to talk a bit about some of the trends and some examples of off-site, and then we're going to talk about what is it we need to do to prepare for this transition. So let's just think about off-site construction. Again, there are lots of different words that people talk about in here. I mean, some people use the word off-site, some people use the word modular, prefabricated, design for manufacturing, assembly, and so on. In my mind, they're kind of different flavours of the same thing, so we shouldn't get too hung up about the terminology. But let's just think about what this really means. So first of all, it's really about moving to a model where we're moving more to an assembly on site type model on the construction site, and really doing less work on the construction site and more work off-site in typically a manufacturing type environment. So it's changing the model of how we build. And as part of that, it's very important that one of the things we're really trying to do here is drive towards a more standardized model, and that comes in two forms. One is in terms of standardized processes, trying to get a more consistent way of executing projects, but also getting more standardization in terms of the materials and components and so on that we use in a construction asset. So, because I think generally speaking, the industry is certainly guilty of reinventing the wheel, and when we design new buildings and new assets, we tend to have a habit of designing things from scratch every time rather than reusing standards. And you can think of the kind of Lego principle. If we can have standard components and standard panels and so on and standard sizes, then we can get economies of scale, we can get higher quality, we can get reduced cost and so on. I think that's something that the industry really needs to learn from other industries to try and get a more standardized approach. On top of that, we think about modules, people think about off-site or modular construction. They very often think of the picture I'm showing you in the background there, a floor or a building or a module, for example, or a pod or a bathroom pod and those types of things. But it's much more than just modules. It's components, it's panels, it's fabrications, it's steel structures, it's wooden structures and so on. It's really any type of thing that we might manufacture off-site and then ship to the site to be assembled. And last but not least, we need to think about designing this from the outset. So one of the key things here is that there's no point in designing a new asset and then as an afterthought, oh, maybe I should build this using off-site principles. It simply doesn't work that way. You have to think right from the beginning that we're going to build the asset using off-site and assembly type principles on site. And that then means the whole way we look at it is different. And that has huge advantages because it will cut down the design time. It will means we'll be firming things up earlier in the process, and then we'll basically be able to have less change in the process itself. So let's just think about why is this trend becoming very, very important now? And there's a lot of trends in the industry that are driving change, and let's just talk about a few of these right now. So first of all, global competition. There's no doubt that the landscape of the global world is changing. We've got definitely Asia is gaining market share over the rest of the world. And I did a little study not so long ago about the top 100 construction companies in the world, and I think it's fair to say that Asia's now got about 60% of the top 100 construction companies, and 15 years ago that was about 40%. So they're squeezing Europe and they're squeezing the US in terms of the big construction companies. So competition's definitely intensifying. On top of that, we're seeing a sort of model moving to what we call a through life model, and what I mean by that is that the clients and the asset owners are typically wanting the construction companies to provide a service through the entire life cycle of the asset. So typically, in simple terms, moving to providing a service or facilities management or property management contract to look after the operation and maintenance of the asset through its life. And then perhaps in the future we'll end up not having a construction project and a separate service FM contract, but having one contract for the whole outcome of the asset. And I think that's where we're heading. So there's another big change that's happening in the industry. And then if we talk about other changes, new entrants, for example. We are seeing new entrants coming into the market that traditionally weren't in the construction industry, and that's to a large extent because of this topic called off-site modular construction, because if we're going to do more work off-site and more work in manufacturing plants and less work on the construction site, that drives us towards needing to think more about standardization, more about logistics, shipping, and assembly on site. And that's something that companies outside the construction industry are already very, very familiar with and very good at executing that type of model. So we're seeing companies come into the market, and we'll show you a few examples of these as we go forward. What else? The industry suffers from a skills shortage and an ageing workforce problem. I don't think anyone would argue with that. And also the productivity has remained pretty static for many, many, many years. So we're way behind other industries in terms of productivity. And on top of that, I would argue that our delivery performance isn't as good as it needs to be. So basically, projects are typically not delivered on time. They're typically not delivered on budget. They're typically, the quality is not very good, and so on and so forth, and so on. So we need to improve our delivery performance, and all of that results in the fact that our margins aren't particularly great in this industry. So we need to do something to make more money, particularly given the current challenging times we have today. And last but not least, technology. In terms of the industry, again, if you compare it to other industries, typically is a laggard. It tends to be slow to adopt new technology, new business methodologies, and so on and so forth, not very standardized processes. So we really need to accelerate the use of modern technology to try and eat into the performance of the business, actually try and improve the business performance as it is today. So those are some of the challenges. I love this slide here because I kind of think, what is this transition we're trying to make? Now, this is a little bit of a joke, but there are some construction companies out there where the construction sites might look a bit like this. And of course, I know that wouldn't be true of anyone that's listening to the presentation today, but in simple terms, we're trying to go from that world to something that looks a bit like this. And this is a lovely slide I've stolen from a company I work with, Bryden Wood, and they're very hot on the whole area of BIM and off-site and modular construction, and they're advising the government in the UK on a lot of the trends here. But this is a great picture, I think, because it depicts where we're trying to get to. You can see a very organised construction site with lots of standard components with standard sizes, ready to be kitted and picked and assembled into an asset on site. And that's really the world we're trying to get to. And I think most companies are a long way from getting to this level of control and structure in what they do. But this is, I think, the end goal of what we're trying to achieve. So just a few examples then. Off-site construction, here's Amazon have actually entered the market. We talked about new entrants. So guess what? Amazon are very good at what? Logistics and supply chain. And actually the world we're moving into is going to put an awful lot more emphasis in managing supply chain and off-site effectively. So I think that's why you're seeing companies like Amazon enter the market. Another example here, again, from my friends at Bryden Wood, which I think is a great example, where they talk about this concept called factory in a box. And this was an example where they'd worked alongside GlaxoSmithKline to build pharmaceutical factories outside, in foreign countries, for example. And the idea here was to build a standard kit, shown in the left-hand picture there, with colour-coded parts, a bit like what you do if you went into IKEA, and then you ship them to site, and then unskilled labour who doesn't necessarily even speak particularly good English can look at colour-coded instructions and build a factory. Very impressive, and they claim these types of benefits: 60% reduction in time of the project and a 75% reduction in the labour cost, which I think is phenomenal achievement by taking a completely different approach. And it's enough. I talk about the Lego principle and so on. But you're probably aware that IKEA formed a joint company with Skanska to build houses, and again, very interesting because IKEA, what are they good at? Standardisation, logistics, assembly, that's what they do. So they're really taking that expertise into the construction industry and joining forces to say this is a new model of how we can execute construction projects in a completely different way. So a few other examples then. Babcock. Babcock is actually one of our customers actually, but they build these two lovely big aircraft carriers on the left-hand side. They're a defence contractor, but fundamentally engineering company, just built those two huge complex aircraft carriers. But of course, because they have the expertise to build things in a structured way, they therefore easily move into the construction space. So they then moved into building some modules for the oil and gas industry in the middle, and then of course more recently they built lots of M&E modules, prefabricated modules for Terminal 5, for example, and also they've done work in hospitals. So this is a very good example here. Here's a shipbuilder or engineering company entering the construction marketplace. And this was just a quote from AMEC as part of that project there. When they did the Terminal 5 project, they were aiming to have 70% of the building services prefabricated by the end of the project. So there's already good examples out there where we're deploying these off-site principles to great effect. Another example, so it doesn't have to be, this is electrical cabinets, electrical components. Again, another IFS customer. You can see here some of the advantages they're claiming in terms of reduced, labour time and cost and so on by doing off-site manufacturing and then shipping to site to install. Another example, Premier Modular. Again, the word is the clues in the name there. They're a modular manufacturing business, but actually they're a hybrid, what I call a hybrid business. They're a contractor. They're an off-site manufacturing business, and they actually build permanent buildings, but they also build temporary buildings. So they hire these modules, accommodation modules in this example, to build a building, and then they rent it out for a period of time, hire it out for a period of time during the life of that project, and then they dismantle it and bring it back to site, and then they put those modules back into their hire pool, and then they wait for another project to come along, and then they'll configure those modules to suit another project's requirements. So they're what I call a hybrid business. So they're much more than they're a contractor, they're a manufacturing business, and a hire business all rolled into one. And similarly, somebody like NG Bailey, as an example, they've got an off-site manufacturing business doing mechanical and electrical modules, very complex modules here for things like the rail industry, for example. But again, likewise, they're a hybrid business. They're an M&E contractor, they're an off-site manufacturer, and they're a service business as well. So we talked about the need to transition towards a service business. So IFS as a company, we've been involved in this industry for many years, and I have to look at predicting where we're going to end up in the future, which is interesting because it also will drive our product strategy. So this is our prediction for the future, that within 5 years, 50% of all construction projects will be using off-site or modular principles and or 3D printing, and the benefits we're going to get from that are 40% reduction in project timescales and a 35% reduction in project costs. So there are big reasons why this is a game changer for the industry. And I don't really think we're going to really attack some of these challenges and things like margins and productivity and so on unless we actually take a different approach. So what do we need to do to prepare for this transition? If we want to look like this picture in the background here, we need to do things quite differently in many cases. So just to give you some thoughts here. So we've talked about this hybrid model here, and this is really saying construction companies today need to be thinking about moving to maybe a hybrid model. And what does that mean? It means you might have to be thinking about becoming a manufacturing business tomorrow, which is a fundamental change in your business model. But it might not necessarily be you have to be manufacturing. It might be you just have to think about what do we need to do to be able to execute a off-site construction model. So you might not necessarily need to manufacture, but you need to be much more competent at logistics and so on, and shipping and assembly on site. And of course, you might also have to be a service business as well, and actually allow to take on service contracts and FM contracts, as some of these other businesses I just showed you a second ago. And that's particularly topical right now because of the COVID pandemic, because I think what we're seeing is an acceleration of that trend. Because if you've got a strong service business, you've got guaranteed, pretty much guaranteed repetitive revenue going forward, and you're not so dependent on boom and bust cycles that you get in economic cycles, or obviously in this case a pandemic, which has obviously caused major pain for a lot of companies. So the ones that are stronger are the ones that have got more repetitive revenue. So that's causing a lot of people to think hard about wanting to be a more diversified business. So in short, we're saying, I think we need to think about preparing to support the whole asset life cycle and become an asset life cycle, service provider rather than purely a construction or contracting business. And in addition, we need to think about how do we take these modern technologies. We talk a lot about BIM, of course, and robotics and AI and all these lovely topics. But how do we take these technologies and integrate them into an integrated whole? Because it's no good just having them as islands of information. So, and if we think about the other transition we need to be thinking about is, again, there's a tendency for companies in the construction sector, I would say, to kind of execute projects differently every time. I mean, we tend to take one project in one company, or we form a joint venture, and we tend to execute a project using different methodologies, different reports, different ways of working, almost based on the preference of the individual who's running that project. Now, we need to get away from that type of thinking to a standardized best practice set of processes. And what this diagram is showing here is it's quite complicated, because yes, you're going to have standard processes for a construction company, but you might also have a service or FM or property management business. You might also have an asset or plant business, and increasingly we might, of course, need to open an off-site modular manufacturing business, each with their own set of best practice processes, supported by a common set of back office processes like finance and HR and quality and so on. So this is the kind of the complex landscape that many construction companies find themselves in, and because of that they end up with not really any standardization in any way of actually making this efficient. And in fact, very often I go in and look at the business system landscape and say we end up seeing something like this, lots and lots and lots of different business systems from different companies. Then we try and build some integrations, which are the black lines on here. The reality is those integrations usually don't get done in most cases because it's just too complicated. And then we start to see this happening. We start to see Excel spreadsheets popping up all over the place. And we end up with hundreds, if not thousands, of Excel spreadsheets in the business, which really become the primary source of management information to every level of management in the business. And that really isn't efficient at all. And it's also prone to a huge amount of manipulation, for want of a better word. So you can change any number you like in any Excel spreadsheet, and the guys at the top might think everything's in control when it's not actually in control. So I don't think this model is going to work as we go forward if we're going to deal with the complexity and the challenges we're facing. And of course, the simple answer is we need to simplify. We need to have less business systems and actually join the whole. We need an integrated process that includes BIM and collaboration and estimating and planning and so on into the overall business process. But if you've got too many systems of different architectures, you're never going to be able to achieve an integrated business process across all of that. So you're not going to have one business system, but you need to have something that's much simpler. And this is our diagram just to describe where we think a world-class landscape, what it should look like in the future. Just to talk about some of the benefits we get from off-site, I think this is a lovely diagram I found from a report from McKinsey. It just tries to just explain why is it we're claiming that we can reduce time on projects. And it's quite simple. If you look at this diagram, we basically do the design work, and then we do the foundation work, but then when we start the construction work, we can be doing work on off-site manufacturing in parallel with installing and assembling things on site. So towards the bottom, like you see the blue lines at the bottom, is where we get time compression, and that's one of the main reasons why we can actually execute projects much quicker. So to do that, we need a system. Obviously, we need to put much more importance around having a project plan, which is what this is saying. We need a project plan and Gantt chart, which represents the timeline of executing an off-site project, which would basically engineering, procurement, manufacturing, shipping, and then assembly on site. So there's that kind of logical time scale there that's happening across maybe multiple phases of a project. So we need to make the program integrate to the business process and not just be what I call a pretty picture of a program that doesn't really join to the business processes. And this diagram kind of describes that. So on the left-hand side, we've got the program. It links into the timeline and the work breakdown structure. On the right-hand side, we ideally should have BIM driving the physical world, and that should integrate into a physical view of the objects. And then from that world, we join the two worlds together. We've got time dimension and the physical dimension linked together. That then can drive a time phase material plan or execution plan to say, what do we need to buy? What do we need to manufacture? Then what do we need to ship to site to then achieve that job? And then what is it? Then we need to get it to construction site, and then need to assemble and construct on site. So that's the kind of business process that the offsite is moving us towards. And I think there's some challenges in trying to transition to that completely different business model. So if we think about this from a process point of view, traditional construction companies will talk about the typical processes on the left-hand side there, and of course there's a lot more than what I'm describing here, but it's things like managing contracts, managing change, variations, risk, estimating and so on. So that's a traditional view of a typical landscape for processes and business systems in the construction sector today. But if we suddenly move to an off-site model, we actually need to think differently. There's a whole load of new processes that we need to think about integrating to that whole. So we need to think about bringing the BIM model in and bringing the physical structure in to drive the execution of that off-site process. We need to think about things like part numbers and inventory and tracking and kitting and bills and materials, because traditionally, when I would say most construction companies I speak to, when you talk about part numbering or catalogues, they go, oh, we don't use them. We just buy by description every time, and every project's different. And that's kind of back to the fact that we don't really think in a standardised way. But how can you operate an assembly on site and a kitting process and a shipping logistics process and know where things are if you don't have proper part numbering and inventory control? We just cannot do it properly, and that's probably the biggest single change that the industry needs to think about. And it comes from changing the mindset to a standardised model and moving more to a kind of assemble to order type mindset. So I think there are huge changes required to execute these new business processes and combine them with the existing business processes. So you can't really see them as two separate sets of processes. They have to be joined at the hip, and they have to work as an integrated whole. And I think that's really where we need to get to if we're going to be successful in executing this off-site model. So one last slide then, and then we'll go open up for questions. They basically, IFS, for those of you who don't know who we are, we're quite a large company actually. We operate over 65 countries, or 65 offices, say, but across most of the countries in the globe, over 10,000 customers, over 4,000 people, and impressively, we've been growing by over 20% a year in the recent times. So that's, I think, a reflection of the fact that we have a very strong business system solution described here as a digital ERP backbone, which is very, very centred around the construction industry, and we understand in great detail how the construction industry works, and their whole strategy is to try and assist companies with this moving forward in terms of this type of transition we've talked about today. So thank you for listening today. I'm really going to throw it open now for questions.
Thanks a lot for that, Kenny. The first question that I have is, what is the difference this time? I mean, people have spoken about, modular construction offsite. There's been many false dawns. What is the difference?
Yeah, I think it's just a journey I think people are on. I think it takes time for people to accept the change. And it's quite a traditional industry, so I think there's resistance, to change in every company I speak to. So I think that, of course, the difference is probably now COVID maybe has accelerated the need. We need to improve our business performance. We need to improve our productivity. We have got a labour shortage. We've got challenges everywhere we look in the industry, and I kind of see this as a kind of tipping point in the industry that we need to now change. We can't keep putting this off. We've kind of worked on the same business model probably for 100 years in the construction sector, and also I think the other thing is because of the off-site thing, where there are new entrants coming into the market, as we talked about, the Skanskas with IKEA and the Amazons, and who knows, Google might enter this market tomorrow. We've got manufacturing businesses, banks entering the market. I just think they're going to change the game, because if the industry doesn't change, they're going to force that change upon us. And we're hitting this inflection point, really, that every business goes through cycles where you have to make big decisions about changing your business model. And if you make those decisions, you go on an exponential growth curve. And if you don't make those decisions, you go on a decline, right? And I think that's where we are right now. So I think the new entrants are going to force people to think hard about how they need to make that model work in the future, or they simply will decline. And I think that's what will drive the change, I think more so than ever.
Wondering in terms of what you see as the main point of resistance to modular within the industry, and whether you think that's rooted in either the structure of the industry or the culture.
Probably all of this. Yeah, I think it's a traditional industry, isn't it? I mean, I think there's people who have grown up in traditional quantity surveyor type thinking and so on, and a lot of the companies have grown as family businesses and expanded. And I just think there's there are huge resistance to doing things in a structured way, in a standardized way, and it's just very hard. I think as the next generation comes through, which is starting to happen, and then we have got an aging workforce, I think that resistance will diminish. It's a great industry. It's fantastically complicated. We're making amazing assets. There's great opportunities with digital technology and BIM and so on to really make this a very exciting industry. My son's working as a BIM expert in the industry, and I think when that generation come through, they're going to see things very differently. So I think it's just a whole combination of factors. I think it's just tradition, people resistance to change, and we've always done it this way. Why do we need to change? And as long as we're making money, then why do we need to do anything different? But the minute that gets put under question, then obviously you'll be forced to make a change because somebody will come and do it differently, and you'll force the change upon them. So I think it's just cultural more than anything else.
Are you surprised at how long, considering the margins involved in construction, how resilient or resistant to the change that the industry has been up until this point?
Yeah, I suppose I am, but I think it needs someone to come in from a different perspective to make the change, because everyone thinks that everyone's doing it kind of the same way, and they all say, well, why would we do it any differently? And it's not until you see someone challenging the status quo. And I talked about Brian Wood, Jamie Johnson, guy I think very interesting chap. He's got a very interesting views of how things should change, and even government, for example, need to, we mandated BIM, for example, but the government probably needs to mandate mandate offsite modular construction methods more than they've done in the past, right? Schools, some of these assets we're building, there's no reason why we should be building them and using traditional methods in my head when we're building, simple repetitive type assets that can be built in that way. I just think it's resistance everywhere, but the government needs to drive change as well as the companies themselves, but the market will drive it ultimately because of cost, because of speed, because of quality, and I think that's what will ultimately drive the change. And if you don't react, somebody else will do it for you. So,
you touched on the kind of impact of COVID. Could that be the catalyst for all of this stuff happening? I was speaking to a modular contractor yesterday who said they have been inundated with requests. Is this going to be the tipping point?
I think it possibly will, because it's forcing financial pressure on people, and obviously, unfortunately, I guess some people are probably going to struggle to come through this, unfortunately, which is terrible. But at the same time, that might be the catalyst to say the ones that do come through and actually see it as an opportunity to invest and change. And we see it in our business. We're sort of saying, does that mean people should stop investing in modern methods? And interestingly, we did a study, and we think 70% of people we spoke to in the industry, and this is not just UK, globally, have actually say they want to. It's actually increased the intensity by which they want to invest in new technology, new methods, not the other way around. So, but the ones, of course, that say I'm going to batten down the hatches, have no money to spend, and don't want to change, might be the ones that don't come out the other end of this, unfortunately. So I think it probably will accelerate the need for it. And I've got clients of ours also who are in the modular space who have actually seen opportunities as a result of this. And we talked about temporary buildings, for example. I mean, schools, we need more space. We need to separate people. We can't just magically create bigger offices in 5 minutes. So temporary buildings is an interesting answer. So they've actually suddenly seen a big increase in demand because of which might only be temporary in this case, but hopefully temporary in this case. But I think certainly this is going to be a game changer. I think it changes a lot of things. I think it changes the way people think about working from home, for example. I don't think we're going to go back to having packed offices in London ever again. I think people have got used to the idea of working from home. Companies are realising they don't need to have expensive offices to the same degree. Why would people want to spend their whole life travelling in trains 2 or 3 hours a day? It's complete waste of time and money. So I think the model that's going to change the behaviour as well in many cases.
Last question. There's been some major changes to immigration policy in the UK. The construction industry already had an issue with labour. I'd be interested to know in terms of how you see that as a driver.
Yeah, I mean, I think we talk about labour shortage. It's been talked about for a long time. I don't think it's getting any better, and I think it's resulting in poor quality as well. Because you've got a labour shortage, it means you have to bring in people that aren't necessarily the most skilled or experienced. That also means that the labour rates get driven up. which means you end up with poor quality and high cost, right? And I think, look at the house building sector as a good example of that. There's so many horror stories out there when you look at house building of dreadful quality. And it's a result of many things. But there's a market, I think, taking house building as an example, which is absolutely, in my head, perfectly suited to the offsite modular manufacturing model, right? And not just for affordable homes, lower value homes. I think for any level in the housing market, So I think we're already seeing house builders investing in, some of them investing in factories. I think that's a huge area where it's going to expand, and by doing that, we'll reduce the need for skilled labour. We'll reduce the labour cost down. We'll be able to bring people out of school, for example, and train them in factories to do assembly processes without being skilled electricians and highly paid tradesmen, right, which are in short supply. So I think this is an answer to a lot of the problems. It's going to improve quality, it's going to reduce cost, it's going to help to deal with the labour shortage, it's going to help to bring young people into jobs. There's so many benefits here that I think will materialise, and I think COVID is probably going to accelerate it, as you say.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kenny.
Pleasure. Thank you for listening.